Ladies and gentlemen, we are assembled today to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we as women are taxed to support. We women, in trying to make our case clear, have always made as part of our argument and urge upon the men in our audience a fact, a very simple fact. We women are also human beings. Oh, they've called us militant, and we are quite willing to accept the name. We are determined to press this question of the enfranchisement of women to the point where we can no longer be ignored by the politicians. We wear no mark. We belong to every class. We permeate every class of the community from the highest to the lowest. And so you see in this women's civil war, the dear men of my country are discovering it is impossible to deal with it. You cannot locate it, and you can never, ever stop it. Votes for women! Well, I must say, it's nice to be joined by so many like-minded people. Thank you for joining me in this, our campaign for women to be given equal rights and the vote. It's been a long journey, even to get us to this point, and I am proud and unashamed to stand here today and speak out for what I believe in. The move for women to have the vote really started in 1897, when Millicent Fawcett founded the National Union of Women's Suffrage. Suffrage, by the way, means the right to vote, and that is what we women want, which is why it's in Fawcett's title. Millicent believed in peaceful protest and felt that any violence or trouble would persuade men that women are not to be trusted to have the right to vote. Her game plan was this: patience and logical arguments. She pointed out that women could hold responsible posts in society, such as sitting on school boards, and yet they are not trusted to vote. She argued that if Parliament made laws and if women have to obey those laws, then women should be part of the process of making the laws. If we as women have to pay taxes just as the men do, then we should have rights just as the men do. Much as I admire Millicent Fawcett and her suffragists, for me her methods are just they're too slow, they're too methodical. Some of us women want results, and we want them fast. And yes, she did manage to convert some of the members of the Labour Representation Committee, soon to be the Labour Party, to her cause. Most men in Parliament believe that women simply do not and could never understand how Parliament works, and therefore we should not be a part of the electoral process. How dare they? How dare they speak to us like that and treat us like we are children? We need to show them once and for all what women can achieve. Led by Emeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, the Women's Social and Political Union was set up in 1903. They want women to have the right to vote, and they're not prepared to wait. We members of the union are better known as the Suffragettes, and we are prepared to go to any means to get what we want. In 1905, Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney interrupted a political meeting in Manchester to ask two Liberal politicians, Mr. Winston Churchill and Sir Edward Grey, if they believed women should have the right to vote. Neither men even bothered replying. So the two women got out a banner which had the words "Votes for Women" emblazoned across it, and they shouted at the two politicians to answer their questions. Now, such actions are all but unheard of. It's etiquette to remain silent and listen courteously to a public speaker, even if you don't agree with what he's saying. But Pankhurst and Kenney threw all such etiquette out of the window. They in turn were thrown out of the meeting and arrested for causing an obstruction and the technical assault of a police officer. Both women refused to pay the fine. They said that they would prefer to go to prison, as that would highlight the injustice of the system. Emeline Pankhurst said that this was the beginning of a campaign, the like of which was never known in England, or for that matter in any other country. We interrupted a great many meetings, and we were violently thrown out and insulted. Often we were painfully bruised or hurt. The age of the active demonstration had been born. We suffragettes will stop at nothing to get our ideals heard, and I could not be prouder to be part of a militant and exciting movement. Because the Church of England does not support us, we have burned their churches. Because the King and the royal family have done nothing to help us or shown any support for our cause, we have chained ourselves to the railings outside of Buckingham Palace. Some sister suffragettes have refused to pay their taxes. Others have verbally abused politicians as they walk through the streets. Golf courses have been destroyed and gentlemen's clubs have been vandalised. One of my very favourite days was when I was invited to join some suffragette pals for a day out in London. A group of us hired some boats and we went rowing down the Thames. We made it look as if we were going for a genteel picnic along the river. We carried parasols and wore our prettiest tea gowns. But once we got outside the Houses of Parliament in our little boats, we pulled out loud hailers and shouted abuse to all inside and outside so they could hear us. Using language that would make a sailor blush, I let rip. And I told those men in their ivory tower exactly what I thought of them and their antiquated policies. My goodness, it felt so liberating and cathartic to be able to be free with my thoughts and actions and words. Till we got to shore, of course, then we had to peg it so the police couldn't catch us. The tide turned soon enough, and the light-heartedness of this incident was quickly overshadowed. On the 18th of November, we discovered that the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, who was deeply hostile to women's suffrage, had announced that no more time would be given to a bill which would give the vote to some women. So, in protest, 300 women, myself included, went to the House of Commons, where we were met by ranks of police. For 6 hours, women around me were hit with batons, beaten, punched, thrown to the ground, kicked on the floor. One policeman grabbed my hair and rubbed my face against the railings in full view of the House of Commons. The police treated us like we were little more than cattle, taunting us by lifting our skirts and grabbing at us. Black Friday, we called it. At least 2 women died as a result of their injuries that day, and another woman who'd been badly treated by the police and was arrested for stone throwing died a few days later. She died just after being released from prison on Christmas Day 1910, and she was Emeline Pankhurst's sister, Mary Clark. Up until now, we had called a truce on militancy. But now that truce was well and truly over, and we launched a campaign of window smashing in response to the police violence we witnessed that day. I mean, why let yourself be hurt and abused for hours before being arrested on a demonstration when you can shorten the whole process by smashing a window and obtaining instant arrest? Of course, it was a political statement. We were exposing that the government cared more about a pane of glass than about a woman's life or her political rights. If property was the government's priority, then property was our target. You will no doubt have heard of the famous incident on Oxford Street, where using bricks and anything we could find, we smashed every single window. Well, that day was my downfall. Soon after we had smashed the windows, we all fled in different directions. I hid the toffee hammer that I had used down my skirt and I headed to the pub. Out of sight, out of mind, that's what I thought, hiding in plain sight. I sat with the first pint of ale I've ever had in my life and engaged in some light-hearted banter with some nice chaps who, if they had known who I was and what I had just done, would no doubt have thrown me in the gutter and stamped on me. They didn't have to. You see, I was followed there, and I soon found myself in the shadow of a very tall police officer. With nowhere to run and no one to help me, I had to give in and go with him. Accused of breaking windows and threatening to burn buildings. At my trial, I turned to my jury, made up entirely of men, of course, and said, I ask you to have nothing further to do with this case. Not for my sake, but for the sake of your own honour. That is, colluding with a system of trying voteless women with man-made laws. I ask you, good people, what would you have done with me? Well, they sentenced me to 6 months' imprisonment. Prison was cold and lonely, yet of course it was an honour to be imprisoned for such a worthy cause. Pride and hope swelled my chest, and like my sisters before me, I vowed that I would follow in their footsteps, and I too would go on hunger strike. I did this as a means of passive resistance to the injustices that women experience simply because of their sex. I did it too to prove a point, to keep campaigning, albeit within the walls of the jail. Refusing all food and water over 4 days, I gradually became weaker and weaker. And then the moment I had been dreading came. Then they arrived with their dreaded tubes and funnels, and they force-fed me. This went on for several weeks, and everything else about my time in jail just pales into insignificance as a result. When my sentence was over, and I was released from prison, I was greeted on the outside by a group of suffragettes who gave me a medal to mark my time in prison and the fact I'd been on hunger strike, and they took me home to care for me until I felt fit again. Undeterred by what I had experienced and the prospect of doing it all again, I continued in my campaign for women to get the vote. By 1913, force-feeding became so cruel and dangerous that the Cat and Mouse Act was brought in. This allowed a hunger-striking suffragette who became ill to be released into the community in order to regain her health, only to be rearrested when she was well enough to complete her sentence. It dragged everything out for so much longer, and in some ways it was no better than the dreaded tubes. 1913 was also the year that the suffragette campaign came to a shocking and a violent head. In February, the Times newspaper reported, "An attempt was made yesterday morning to blow up a house which is being built for Mr. Lloyd George near Walton Heath Golf Links. One device had exploded, causing about £500 worth of damage, whilst another failed to ignite." With discarded hairpins and hatpins and only the sound of a motor car to go on, it was fortunate that the police soon had a confession. For that evening, at a meeting held in Corey Hall, Cardiff, Mrs. Emeline Pankhurst, one of the leaders of the Militant Suffragette Society, the Women's Social and Political Union, remember them, she declared, "We have blown up the Chancellor of the Exchequer's house." And she stated that for all I have done in the past, I accept responsibility. I have advised, I have incited, I have conspired. It was also the year that one of our number, Emily Wilding Davison, who'd been a fervent and committed suffragette, suffered a terrible accident and died for the cause. A former teacher, Wilding Davison, had been imprisoned several times. In March 1909, Emily Wilding Davison was arrested for attempting to hand a petition to the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. She was found guilty of causing a disturbance and sentenced to 1 month imprisonment. She was in and out of prison for the next few months, even going on hunger strike too. On one occasion, she was sentenced to hard labour for throwing stones wrapped in her favourite words, "Rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God." One thing she feared the very most was the force-feeding. And on one occasion at Strangeways Prison in Manchester, she used prison furniture to barricade the door of her prison cell to stop them coming in with the dreaded hose and funnel. So, a prison officer climbed a ladder and pushed the nozzle of a hose pipe through a window and into her cell. He then proceeded to try to drown her out. Emily was willing to die, but before the cell was completely filled with water, the door broke down and she survived. The force-feeding was as barbaric and stressful as when I received it, and Emily, she just couldn't take it. Her only way out was suicide. She thought some desperate protest must be made to put a stop to the hideous torture which is now our lot, and that by her martyrdom one tragedy might save the life of many others. She climbed an iron staircase and threw herself off the top. But she got caught in the wire netting in between the floors, which caused severe spinal injuries. Had she been successful in falling, she almost certainly would have died. As a result of her actions, the cat and mouse was brought into effect, and she also received 40 shillings in damages for the hosepipe incident, the first suffragette ever to get compensation. After another spell in prison for setting fire to pillar boxes, Emily became even more militant. And now she was hell-bent on making a huge impact, maybe even a sacrifice. And she came up with her most daring plan to date. She was going to attempt to pin her suffragette colours to the bridle of King George V's horse, Anmer, as it raced at the Derby at Epsom. On the day of the race, Emily bought a return ticket for the railway and was apparently looking forward to a holiday with her sister. She found herself a place at the front of the railings and settled down to watch the race. A race which would change history. A friend who was with her said that a minute before the race started, she raised a paper on her own or some kind of card before her eyes. I was watching her hand, she said. It did not shake. Even when I heard the pounding of horses' hooves coming closer, I saw she was still smiling, and suddenly she slipped under the rail and ran out into the middle of the racecourse. Emily reached up to the horse's bridle, but instead of stopping or even slowing down, the horse was unable to pull up, and Emily was thrown beneath its thrashing hooves. Some people believe that she was trying to cross the track, thinking the horses had already passed by. Others believe she had tried to pull the horse down. I believe that she was so devoted to her cause, she wanted to get the attention of the king himself. And since the closest she could get to His Majesty was Anmer, his horse, she decided to do something extraordinary. In fact, she had been practicing on other horses in the park and had succeeded in slowing them. But this wasn't the park. This was the Derby, the fastest race on the fastest horses. She never stood a chance. All she was trying to do was attach the suffragette colours to the king's horse's bridle. Surely, if that horse came home bearing our colours, we could not be ignored. And we were not. Emily's accident and subsequent death from her wounds caused shockwaves right across the country. We had a martyr, see? And thousands of suffragettes attended her funeral. And now we remain as keen as ever to get the vote, that her death may not be in vain. But I hear the rumblings of war across Europe, that we may soon be facing our greatest threat yet, and perhaps we will have to lay down our mantle for a short time and turn our attention to another great cause. However, and whatever occurs, I will keep campaigning for my rights, for our rights. Sisters, we must all live together, safe, free, and equal. Votes for women!